All right, welcome to part 2 of schizophrenia. All right, let's move on. So I talked about lobotomies, and it's pretty horrific. And I mean, they didn't stop until the later 1950s. And so pretty amazing that this barbaric treatment was still occurring even back, even in the 50s and 60s. So why did it stop? Like I mentioned before, they finally figured out some antipsychotic medications like chloropromazine. That was the first reason. Okay, now maybe we shouldn't destroy a huge chunk of someone's brain when we can give them a pill. And there was criticism. So it's not to say that people did frontal lobotomies and everybody's saying, "Oh, that's great, stick a ice pick in someone's brain." There was always a lot of debate, and people were not all in favor of frontal lobotomies. So people were fighting it from the very beginning. So that helped, along with, more importantly, perhaps, these drugs that were developed. And interesting, that drug, and pretty much every major drug that is even today currently used to treat schizophrenia, is a powerful dopamine D2 receptor antagonist. So it blocks the function of the D2 dopamine receptor. And if you remember, the D2 is an autoreceptor. It's an inhibitory receptor. It turns down the activity of a neuron. So those are just things to keep in mind when we get further along in the mechanisms of these drugs and what is schizophrenia in the brain. Symptoms. All right, I already talked about the positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms previously, the hallucinations, the delusions, the lack of emotion in the negative, and the logical thinking. But I do want to say that there's a great deal of individual variation in these symptoms, in that no two individuals will often have the same constellation of symptoms. And these people who do have different sets of symptoms might have slightly different neurobiological condition, that their brains might be slightly different, so they may need better or different mixtures of drugs to treat their particular form of schizophrenia. All right, so to example, like if you have somebody who has many more positive than negative symptoms, those patients tend to be treated much better with these D2 receptor antagonist drugs. The more powerful the D2 antagonism is, the better the positive symptoms and the better their prognosis is. All right. So I'm going to go ahead right now and give a little more detail on what the positive and the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are like. So I already mentioned the auditory hallucinations, but that comes in the form of hearing voices. And those voices aren't generally pleasant. Those voices are typically very negative, insulting, or commanding, or demeaning. These voices are ones that anybody who has schizophrenia probably is desperate to have them go away. It's not like they're their little imaginary friend. These voices are their own worst enemy. In addition to those hallucinations, you have delusions, which are different than hallucinations in that they're more of these general feelings of persecution. It's not like you're actively hearing some other voice of somebody else in your head. You're feeling instead a more general feeling, in this case, of being persecuted. Maybe you're paranoid. You have these beliefs that maybe a bunch of different individuals are conspiring, or that you're being observed through a hole in your wall or something like that. And it's common to have the idea that thoughts are being broadcast from your head into the world, or that thoughts are being broadcast into your head, which would feed into the auditory hallucinations too. So you have these delusions that you're getting input, or that your thoughts are being sent out to. There's also thought disorder. Usually unusual or dysfunctional ways of thinking, like very illogical thought, like listening to somebody who's schizophrenic, perhaps at least when they're in their very strong positive phase, try to reason through something. It usually makes no sense. They no ability to kind of recognize reality sometimes. And then you also get, and the book talks a lot about these, a lot of movement disorders too. You might have agitated body movements, strange postures, a lot of repetitive or rocking movements. And there's some interesting, which I won't talk about, but there's some interesting eye movement issues in schizophrenia, suggesting that part of the motor system, which also, by the way, gets a lot of dopamine, might just be disrupted in schizophrenia. Yes, as I mentioned before, blocking these dopamine D2 receptors really seems to help patients with the positive symptoms, not the negative symptoms, which is interesting, only the positive symptoms, and not the cognitive symptoms either. So, for some reason, blocking these D2 receptors seems to help eliminate these hallucinations and delusions. The answer is not necessarily intuitive. I'm not going to even hint at it yet. Maybe start thinking about it, but I'll get into that in the next lecture. I also want to, before ending the positive symptoms, I just want to make a note on psychosis. So psychosis is like this emotional or perceptual disconnection from reality. I just want to make the statement that psychosis is not exclusive at all to schizophrenia. We've already talked about it in the context of hallucinogens that can create a temporary psychosis. In bipolar disorder, depression can sometimes have psychosis. Sleep deprivation can produce psychosis. Dementia can have psychosis. So it's not exclusive. I'm just saying that psychosis is not exclusive to schizophrenia, just as a note. All right. There's some hints as to the origins of schizophrenia. If you look at how drugs of abuse impact normal people, like people who don't have schizophrenia, like in your typical individuals, and also the effects of medications. So, for example, dopaminergic stimulant drugs, especially illicit drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine, amphetamine, they, if taken in a high dose, can create some of these hallucinations or delusions, these motor symptoms, these erratic movements that are very, very, very much like the positive symptoms you see in schizophrenia. So, and this is in people who don't have schizophrenia, and healthy individuals. Well, healthy other than that they're taking cocaine and meth. So these individuals now exhibit that. So this all suggests that maybe dopamine's involved in schizophrenia. If you artificially increase dopamine and then you get the schizophrenic-like symptoms, then maybe there's something to it. And also, like I mentioned before, the drugs that block D2 receptors reduce the symptoms, so further suggests dopamine involvement. And now we can talk about glutamate, because drugs, which we've already talked about, PCP, phencyclidine, and ketamine, both create, as we've heard, hallucinations, not necessarily auditory, but you definitely get hallucinations, and you get weird motor symptoms too, that might mimic some of the effects in schizophrenia. And in fact, ketamine is often used in animal models to create a state in their brain and their behavior that's similar to schizophrenia, so that people can study schizophrenia in animal models. So it's interesting that it's still actually used today as a prominent animal model of schizophrenia. So these drugs produce big changes in how you perceive the world, even when they're given to somebody who's not a schizophrenic. And so that suggests that the glutamate system might be involved. If you remember, these drugs, can you remember which receptor PCP and ketamine act upon? If you remember that receptor, then you might see the glutamate connection. All right. Stimulants, this is just to summarize these 2 points. Stimulants release dopamine, and PCP and ketamine antagonize the NMDA receptor. That's what I was suggesting just now. And this suggests that some disruption in your dopamine and glutamate system is part of the cause of schizophrenia. And we still kind of believe that today, but I'm sure it's complicated. All right, and there's another thing about positive symptoms and the onset of schizophrenia and drugs of abuse. Marijuana, if used particularly while young perhaps, although there's still more data that needs to come in here, is linked to schizophrenia. Especially if you, and pretty much mostly, if you have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia. I'll talk about this in a few more slides. Okay, the negative symptoms. So these are not the hallucinations, not the delusions, but more akin to depression. but not necessarily depression. So you get symptoms of flat affect, so lack of emotion, reduced expression of emotions. Your face doesn't really express anything anymore. Your voice tone doesn't. You get reduced feelings of pleasure. I think I mentioned that before. It's called anhedonia. You just don't get joy out of things in life anymore. And you have a difficult initiating things. The motivation is kind of going away. So you might have a hard time beginning or sustaining or getting off the couch. Reduced speaking or interacting. And overall reduced movement. Yeah, you often, either your emotions are absent, but sometimes they can just be disrupted. So you might be happy at a funeral or sad at a wedding. And so you might have a dysregulation of an inappropriateness of certain emotions. You almost have this inability, when people think that this inability to kind of start or be motivated to start activities, maybe that there's just generally a lack of interest in everyday activities anymore. There is also, maybe corresponding to this, a lack of any personal hygiene, taking care of themselves, brushing their teeth, taking a shower, which also leads to further isolation from those around them. And a lot of times, yeah, these symptoms are mistaken for clinical depression. This might not be the case. In schizophrenia, this is clearly a part of the brain systems disrupted in this very specific disease. All right, and finally, the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. They include things like poor executive functioning, this ability to kind of make decisions, plan, to think of the future, and also to inhibit things, like, for example, to not swear at your boss in a particular condition because it might be a bad choice for your career. So this ability to inhibit perhaps your more baser instincts. And then trouble focusing or paying attention to something. That's very common in schizophrenia. And also common are problems with working memory, the ability to kind of keep numbers or things, anything in mind, like even the flow of somebody's sentence. If you're having a conversation with somebody and need to remember what they said a sentence or so previous, you may not if you're exhibiting cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. So to use information, and that might relate to the attention too, because if you can't attend to something, you're not going to have a good memory for that thing either. And none of these three symptoms are improved with antipsychotic drugs. So here's one of the failures of our current treatment of schizophrenia, is that we can treat the positive symptoms all right, but we have a very hard time treating the negative and especially the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay, that's the end of part 2.